radical social movements, arrested people, deported them, etc. And it took a good decade and a half before it got back to where it was before. All right. So again, for some reason, PowerPoint's not working, but this is the PDF that is more or less like the one that you can download from the website. The ones that are on the website are on Backboard are super detailed. These I've shrunk a little bit so that you're not writing up a storm. So this is the basic outline. Let me start off with a continuation of the war. We ended with the section, The War at Home, last class. This is the section where we were talking about the expansion of the federal government's powers, the expansion of propaganda to convince people that World War I was a good war to fight, that the Germans were evil, they were undemocratic, and that Americans must fight the Germans in order to preserve democracy overseas. But people were promised, we are fighting for democracy overseas, and then we are fighting for more democracy at home, especially industrial democracy, giving workers more rights. But what ended up happening, as I mentioned last class, was that there was a lot of repression of dissent. The Espionage Act of 1917 outlawed spying, but it also made it a crime to interfere with the draft. More disturbing, the Sedition Act of 1918 said that you cannot criticize the government in any way. Now think about that for a moment. Think about all the people that are on TV and in print today that call, for instance, President Obama a terrorist, call him unpatriotic. Former Mayor Rudy Giuliani, just a couple of days ago, said that Barack Obama does not love his country because of some other silliness. Well, according to the Sedition Act of 1918, you could legally arrest Rudy Giuliani for doing that. All those people on Fox News that criticize the government every day, or even all those people on MSNBC that feel the government is not being liberal enough, all those people could be arrested today under the Sedition Act. So imagine a country where all the open discussion and criticism of the government was illegal. And that's what America was in 1918 with the Sedition Act. Go ahead.
Don't we have something similar to that?
The Patriot Act is, I'm not an expert on it, but it does authorize a lot of spying on people, and there is a lower bar for what's considered dangerous communications and behavior. Does it connect to terrorism, et cetera, and it certainly is, like the Sedition Act, a response to a crisis, which expands the role of the federal government to get involved in people's day-to-day lives, which has slowly kind of pulled back. Yeah.
The Patriot Act will be more like the Espionage Act.
In terms of just general expansion of the role of government, a response to a crisis, that's what I'm going for. But yeah, you may be correct. You may in fact be correct. I'm not the expert on the Patriot Act. So, what was the other issue that came up? While Americans were running around World War I and they were afraid of the people not supporting the war, people that were potentially unpatriotic, the socialists, there was an increasing discussion of what's at the time was known as the race problem. What does that mean? There was a fear that as America was fighting for its values, that what made up America, its American values, was becoming diluted because there were so many immigrants coming from overseas that they couldn't be assimilated and turned into Americans quickly enough. But there was also a fair amount of racism that was going on as to who could be eventually a true American. Meaning, at this time, for a combination of a fear of immigration, bad science, which is what eugenics is, it's technically a science, how to control the evolution of a population by controlling who can have kids and who cannot. A combination of bad science, fear of immigration, fear that American values are under threat, led to some pretty awful discussions and policies. For instance, nowadays, we talk about ethnicity a lot, race and ethnicity. And it's a combination of physical features and also culture, right? But no one argues today that if you're black, you can't be American, because American means white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant. That's what they were arguing in World War I, when there was this heightened patriotism and this heightened fear of what is American and who can become a real, quote-unquote, American. And nowadays we talk about Italian Americans, Irish Americans, whatever, Greek Americans. Back then, all these non-white Protestant peoples coming over, like the Italians, of a different ethnicity than Anglo-Saxon, were considered, at their core, different, incapable of learning American values. Okay? Which is really no different than some of the worst in the immigration debate nowadays. What does all this really mean? It means that there is some forceful Americanization going on. Nowadays, we have this respect for everyone's different culture. Back then, it was like, no, when you get here, you drop your culture. You learn English, you drink Budweiser, you learn baseball, and that's it. Whatever you brought from your old country, leave it. Now, that's what I mean by forced Americanization. The Germans had it the worst. Because we were at war with Germany, German culture was aggressively shut down. Newspapers, German businesses, German language training, it was all eliminated. Immigrants, recent immigrants, were told you must show your American patriotism publicly over and over. But there was a fear that you couldn't Americanize everybody. So Congress started restricting immigration. Before World War I, Congress let everybody in except for the Chinese with the Exclusion Acts. But Italians, Russians, Eastern Europeans, Greeks, Jews from Eastern Europe, they were all allowed in order to feed the growing American economy. Now there's this fear of we let in too many people, and we don't know if they can actually become real Americans. So cut down on immigration. All immigrants have to know how to read English before they get here. That cut immigration down immediately. Some states, for fear that either immigrants or poor people were ruining the American race, started involuntarily sterilizing people with diseases or mental disabilities. Those women were sterilized. Those men were sterilized so they couldn't reproduce and have children. Yeah. Imagine that. Imagine that. Could you imagine a government going into an insane asylum or a home for people with disabilities or physical handicaps and sterilizing them so they cannot reproduce? Now, that was for white people. You could forcefully Americanize light-skinned people. That was the thinking at the time. But those that didn't have light skin, there was this fear of they can never be true Americans. So, for instance, you can Americanize Italian Americans, Greeks, Russians, Eastern European Jews. Again, teach them English, teach them Protestantism, teach them American culture, la 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 la. They will forget their old cultures. But blacks, especially in the South, rigid segregation was maintained, walling them off from the white communities. Mexicans in the Southwest and in the South, Texas, etc., Also, rigid segregation, walled off in their own communities, their own schools, their own homes, etc., usually of lower qualities. Asian Americans in the West, the few Chinese and Japanese there, again, rigid legal segregation. There was no attempt at assimilation. And even for Puerto Ricans, technically citizens, but not allowed to vote for the president and could only have one measly non-voting representative in Congress. So citizen, but not really. Citizen light. Do you have a hand up, or are you just kind of like doing a thing? Go ahead.
Is that why the Amish were not allowed to teach their kids their religion or like in their language? It had to be in English.
You caught me at a disadvantage. I don't know anything about the Amish except for their desire to live out on their own, to have a very isolated culture, very pacifist, right? So at this time, I could see them being targeted as being too different, and you have to assimilate with society. Now, for African Americans, World War I was a time when there was a belief that maybe you could get somewhere, but not that much. There was incessant barriers to advancement. For instance, in the South, like I mentioned before, you couldn't vote. In the South, you just simply couldn't vote. State laws took the vote away from black men. What about unions? To improve yourself economically, most unions would not recruit black workers. So you can't vote, and you can't join a union to improve your working condition. Women could not get jobs in the expanding industrial sector. They were confined to farm or home labor. The progressives, all those people that wanted the government to expand its authority, to take care of the poor, take care of the little person, to save the poor from the big corporations, the evil banks, those progressives that passed all those laws to help the poor, they had nothing to say about the plight of black men and women in this country, because they themselves were riddled with racism. The women's rights movement, riddled with racism. Union movement, riddled with racism. President Woodrow Wilson, the guy who passed the most laws to make the economy and manufacturing and capitalism simply more fair, was the worst on this. He segregated federal departments where blacks and whites were working. They were segregated. And he fired numerous black federal employees, people directly employed by him. The response to all this in the progressive era leading up to World War I was a change in how African Americans organized themselves. You remember the last time I brought up African American organization, I talked about Booker T. Washington. And I mentioned how at a time in the 1890s when America was incredibly conservative and governments and businesses were basically teaming up together to crush all unionization and worker organization, Booker T. Washington recognized in that conservative time it was best to accommodate the power structure, get along as best as possible, and increase black self-sufficiency, black economic net worth. Don't fight with you, don't go on strike, don't fight with the government, don't fight with employers, because you will not win. By the beginning of the 20th century, there was a new wave in thinking, led by this guy, W.E.B. Du Bois, who founded the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Du Bois was a professor at Atlanta University in Georgia. And he simply couldn't accept Booker T. Washington's idea that for blacks to advance themselves, they should keep their head down, work hard, and hope nobody notices. Because he came from an incredibly educated background, he simply couldn't accept that he should remain a second-class citizen because of his skin color. The NAACP brought together educated blacks to essentially file lawsuits in defense of black rights. Looking at the Constitution and saying, 14th Amendment, I have an equal right to X, Y, and Z, and you sue for it. And in America, you can sue for everything, and it's incredibly effective. The 15th Amendment, guaranteeing the right to vote, regardless of race, he challenged that in court over and over again. But you only got so far. Blacks, like women, felt if they showed obvious patriotism, support for World War I, this would translate into equal rights for blacks. It worked for the women. They were open and aggressive supporters of the war. And what did they get? The right to vote was granted the year after the war was over. Blacks volunteered for service on the front. They were drafted and went and served and died on the front. But none of this helped. They served in segregated units. They didn't fight with white soldiers. They were often not allowed to fight in combat because they weren't trusted. And they were not recognized for their service at the end of the war in parades and marches. Now here's the historical irony. In the American Civil War of 1861 to 65, when Lincoln freed the slaves, one of the first things he did was start recruiting them as soldiers in the Union Army. But even then, they weren't allowed to fight because the belief was they're not really good fighters. At the first sign of danger, they're going to turn around and run away. So, they can carry food and they can dig latrines, but they can't fight. Don't give them guns. Eventually, after a lot of pushing by some units to get in on the fighting, they were given the opportunity to fight. And lo and behold, what did they discover? That blacks had the most reason to win the Civil War and abolish slavery, right? And all of a sudden, like 250,000 blacks signed up for the war to fight. And they were critical in ending the war. Flash forward 50 years, and the same inbred racism comes back. Yes, we need blacks to help with the war effort, but they should just, dig the latrines, cook the food, carry the supplies, but don't put them in combat. Comes back. Now, so patriotism didn't help out. What did help? The cause, or basically the living standards of black Americans. The expansion of industry in World War I to supply the war effort meant there was a need for a lot of work, because a lot of people were drafted and sent overseas to fight. So where is the labor going to come from? Well, blacks in the South were stuck in this cycle of poverty, working on sharecropping farms, or even if they owned their own land, they were making barely a profit. They were locked in a cycle of poverty and political degradation in the South. And now the North needed labor. And they didn't care who they were going to hire, black, white, Asians. They needed people in those factories because the government was ordering trucks, not trucks yet, but bullets and food and clothing and guns. They needed labor. So what you have in World War I is the Great Migration. Something like 500,000 blacks left the South to go looking for work in and settling in Harlem, Detroit, Chicago, out west. The birth of Harlem as the capital of black America happens now. And not just from the South, also from the Caribbean. So, work was found, but the same problems existed. Couldn't join a union, so it was poor paid work. Housing was crappy and it was segregated. And the incredible increase in blacks moving into New York, Chicago, Detroit, etc., led to an outbreak of racial violence. Because all of a sudden, in what was once white neighborhoods, it has now shifted to predominantly black, and that fear of difference overflows into just flat-out violence. 1919, for instance, Chicago, race riots spread through the city like wildfire for 5 days, killing about 40 people. This is basically what one house looks like after a race riot in Chicago in 1919. And the race riots happened from 1917 to 1919, 2 years. Another reflection of greater aggressiveness on the part of blacks to fight against discrimination, segregation, political, economic, etc., was the emergence of Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey, like Booker T. Washington, argued for blacks must educate themselves, support their own businesses, support their own communities, build up wealth, become independent, but also demand equal rights. Not accommodate, but challenge the status quo. Now, Marcus Garvey was also unique for the Back to Africa movement. Garvey said, at the end of the day, you may never get a fair shake in America, so just go back to Africa, where you can escape racism once and for all. This was a powerful call, and some did go back. Garvey was targeted by the federal government, and they eventually got him in a variety of tax evasions and so on and so forth. But he had a powerful call for independence. Now, part of the reason why the U.S. government was so freaked out by people like Marcus Garvey, who were speaking out against the system that they were living in, by people like Eugene Debs that they arrested for criticizing the war effort, is because in 1919, socialism, it felt like it was about to take over the world and destroy capitalism, destroy democracy. Why? A lot of people, workers, especially in America, felt they had been promised, we are fighting this war for democracy overseas and industrial democracy at home. Workers get a fair shake, the 8-hour day, better working conditions, all that stuff. But it didn't happen. In 1917, Vladimir Lenin led his movement, the Bolshevik Party, a socialist party, to success, overtaking Russia, establishing communism, which is a variant of socialism, in Russia. And the belief was, if a country as large as Russia, bigger even than America, can fall to communism, to socialism, then maybe it can happen here in America as well. And it wasn't just successful in Russia, but socialist and communist parties throughout Europe were rising up in rebellion and seeking to overtake their countries. The response was a rabid anti-communism here in America. For instance, the arrest of Eugene Debs. But it gets worse. It gets worse because in 1919, this frustration and this inspiration from communism successful in Europe leads to workers going on strike by the millions, demanding better pay, better wages, better working conditions. For instance, in Seattle, the entire city was on strike for 5 days. Nobody worked. The city shut down for 5 days. The army had to be called in. In Boston, the police went on strike. The entire police stopped working. And there was a massive steel strike involving over 250,000 workers. The result of all this was a massive government crackdown. The fear that the socialism and communism was coming to America. The federal government, they didn't just arrest people like Eugene Debs, but they started raiding the offices of labor groups, workers, unions, socialist, anarchist organizations. They just raided the offices, arrested people who weren't doing anything but publishing pamphlets and peacefully demonstrating. They deported people that had questionable immigration status. After 1919, 1920, these massive raids crushed organized labor in this country. Unions were decimated. Organized radical political groups were decimated. It would take over a decade for a union to come back. And the final thing that I'll leave you with, Wilson promised to make the world a better place by fighting World War I. But what did he accomplish? In his Treaty of Versailles, in the Treaty of Versailles that ended World War I, he got some of what he wanted. The creation of a League of Nations, which is like our United Nations, where all the countries come together to discuss their problems peacefully, not just go to war with each other, technically. He got the creation of new nations in Europe. As the empires broke up, peoples got their own countries, like Czechoslovakia, Poland, Romania, etc. But where he failed was that the peace that he wanted to establish was supposed to be a soft, reasonable peace, so that we could have prosperity in the future. Instead, Germany was punished, and many of the colonies that were taken from Germany were not given independence. They were just given to other countries. Wilson's peace was basically a failure. The Senate rejected the treaty. America didn't sign the Versailles Peace Treaty that ended World War I. They had to negotiate the end of the war separately. America wasn't in the League of Nations, which gave it no military power. But what long-term legacy was left over from all this? America went into World War I to fight for democracy overseas, for open markets, for free markets. And it led to repression at home and the failure to achieve these goals anyway overseas. But it left in people's minds this idea that America should interfere overseas to spread its values, whether it's democracy or capitalism. This is a dangerous precedent because America is now quickly becoming the most powerful economic and military force in the world. And even though they become neutral in the 1920s and 30s and isolationist, they don't want to deal with overseas problems. Beginning in World War II, and especially after, American commitments overseas just continue to expand, as we have today, for better and ill. So that is it. Sorry to keep you well, I'm done on time. So hand in your stuff on the way out, and I will see you on Thursday.
So,